Hey everyone, and welcome to today's webcast. It's a beautiful day for a webcast. It's actually my birthday, so enjoy this webcast as we celebrate. And we're going to learn about the top 5 pitfalls to avoid while bare metal recovery for Active Directory. Sponsored by Semperis and brought to you today by Redmond Magazine. I'm your host, Abu Mukabam, and before we begin, just a few housekeeping reminders to start. We are recording today's show for future viewing purposes, and within 24 hours, we'll send you a link to the email you registered with where you can find the replay. Now, keep an eye out for that, and feel free to share that with others who may be interested. We'll also be having a Q&A session at the end of today's program, so we encourage you to enter your questions at any point. So we have the Ask a Question box on the lower left of your console. So we'll get to as many questions as time permits, but please don't be shy. Ask away. Also, don't forget to check the Resource tab in your doc for more information. We have a link for more information for Semperis and as well as today's presentation. So please check your Resource doc. Now let's introduce today's great speakers. So we have Gil Kirkpatrick. Gil is a Chief Technology Officer at ViewDS. He is a 30-year veteran of the commercial software business, having designed or developed dozens of successful commercial software products. He is well known as the founder of the Popular Directory Experts Conference, the only international conference focused on Microsoft identity and access technologies. And joining Gil today, we have Darren Maralia. Darren is the head of product at Semperis. A 14-year cloud and data center Microsoft MVP, Darren has a wealth of experience in identity and access management and was the CTO and founder of SDM Software, a provider of Microsoft systems management solutions. And as a Microsoft MVP, Darren has contributed to numerous publications on Windows networks, Active Directory, and group policy, and was a contributing editor for Windows IT Pro magazine for 20 years. So guys, thanks you so much for joining us. Gil, the floor is all yours.
Excellent. Thanks, Obum, and happy birthday. I hope you get to spend some fun time after taking care of all these webinars. And Darren, thanks for inviting me onto this thing. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, so thanks, Gil. Good to be here.
The topic today is top 5 pitfalls to avoid with bare metal recovery for Active Directory. Obum covered my bio. I'm the CTO at ViewDS Identity Solutions and the founder of the Directory Experts Conference. I've been active with Active Directory since really before it released, so quite a long time. So let's set the stage a little bit and ask this question. I still have IT managers ask me this occasionally, is why is Active Directory special with respect to disaster recovery? Why can't they just treat it like any other system? And I imagine everybody on this webinar knows the answer to this, but I think it bears repeating. Active Directory, first off, has become the core infrastructure in almost every enterprise network. It's the thing that everybody uses to log in, and after power and networking, it's probably the first thing you have to recover in a disaster recovery scenario. Active Directory is also the system that holds all of the security credentials for most organizations. So not just logging into your workstation or getting access to a SharePoint site or a web server internally, but even things like controlling access to rooms through locks that are enabled through Active Directory or physical gates. So Active Directory really controls access, not just in the digital realm, but in the physical realm as well. And Active Directory has proven to be very reliable and very robust over the years, but the way it does that is by being also very distributed and using replication to keep all of the domain controllers up to date. That distribution and replication makes recovering Active Directory from a disaster a lot more complicated than simply loading a backup and say restoring a database or something like that. And that actually leads us into our first polling question, which is, do you currently have an Active Directory disaster recovery plan? So let's take just a second here. I'd like everybody to go ahead and answer this. We'll see the results on the next slide. My experience has been, going back 15 years doing forest recovery workshops, that most organizations didn't really have a plan for Active Directory disaster recovery. I think in the last, say, 6 years, more and more organizations have a real plan in place. Darren, what's been your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think most often what I see is that folks have backups of Active Directory, but the fact that that doesn't equate to having a disaster recovery plan for Active Directory is unfortunately often lost on many organizations. It's sort of like, let's see, I have to check the box that I have a DR plan for AD. So I'm taking backups, so I'm checking the box. But they haven't actually gone through the process of testing that DR plan or testing those backups to make sure that they can actually recover Active Directory from a total failure.
Yeah. So let's take a look at the results so far. Better than historically, and I would say about what I would have expected, which is a little less than half are saying, yes, we have an Active Directory disaster recovery plan, and almost 40% saying no, they don't have one, which actually that's a little surprising to me. I would expect a smaller number. And then of the people who have one, 14 or about 14% of the respondents say that they don't think it will actually work. And that's not uncommon at all, because a workable DR plan for AD is actually a fairly complex enterprise.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting, Gil, is that if you think about how fundamental AD is to pretty much every organization, that's just a little bit scary. that many organizations are out of the water if something happens to their AD.
Well, I think it actually goes to this next slide here, which is historically, when people have been thinking about Active Directory disasters, they've been primarily thinking about, well, if you go back to 2000 and the first couple of iterations of Active Directory, people were mostly worried about the software working at all and keeping it running in a complex distributed enterprise networking environment. So the recovering from some sort of a software failure was the main concern, and probably the second biggest concern at that time were administrators screwing something up. So, Active Directory is new. People didn't really understand it. It was not difficult for an administrator to foul something up, even just like deleting an OU by mistake. And then third on the list was some sort of a malicious attack by an insider, either an admin or a user who had the ability to log in to AD. And if you look at the threat landscape today, it's entirely different. By far the most, the biggest concern is a malicious attack on the network by an outsider, particularly using either a ransomware or some other form of malware to attack the network. And followed again by administrative errors, somebody fat fingering an OU or something like that. And then at the bottom of the list is some sort of a software failure. And of course, historically, there's always been this issue of physical disasters like a hurricane or massive power failure or something like that. And the risk profile of that hasn't really changed. But this introduction of external threats from attackers using malware has really changed. And just to give you a little perspective on that, just over the last couple of years, there have been some massive malware and ransomware. I group them together because a lot of the attacks were using ransomware, but nobody was actually held for ransom. It was just a way of destroying the network. These are serious companies with serious IT infrastructure and seriously smart people running them. And these dollar values are the costs of the attacks in both lost business and the cost to recover and restore the network to working order. Merck at $870 million, TNT Express, which is a division of FedEx, $400 million. Mondelez, which is, I think, a candy company, if I recall correctly, $188 million. Maersk, $250 million. Maersk, actually, we'll talk about that a little bit more detail. But all of these attacks were from outsiders using very sophisticated malware that's easily available to hackers and criminal groups. And the estimate is for 2019 that there's going to be over $11.5 billion in costs due to external attacks by people using ransomware or other forms of targeted malware. That's a frightening change from the way things were, say, 15 years ago. So I mentioned Maersk. Maersk is interesting because it's probably the best documented case of an attack using a modified ransomware product called Petya. Darren, you want to walk us through sort of what happened with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most interesting part for our purposes is what happened to their Active Directory. So they had their entire Active Directory infrastructure wiped out, except for one server in North Africa that happened to be offline at the time. And I mean, this is all coming from the really excellent Wired magazine article about the sort of play-by-play of what happened at Maersk, where they got access to really detailed information about the sort of the timeline of how this attack happened. And they ended up having to, fly the hard drive of that offline server up to their headquarters location to be able to recover Active Directory. And it was only by virtue of that kind of happenstance of having a domain controller offline and not available that they were actually able to recover AD at all. I think there's been other examples, some of those on that previous slide, where it was a similar situation. I know of one other circumstance where the only way they were able to get AD back was through an old backup that they found offline. And at that, it took them, I think, a couple weeks, if I recall correctly, to get AD fully functional again. So, this, I think it sort of underscores the vulnerability of not just infrastructure in general, but AD in particular.
Right. And the fact that AD is so core to modern corporate IT infrastructure is what makes it so critical to have a recovery plan for it. And the companies that I've called out are all large global companies, but don't think that this is only a problem for large global companies like that. I'm sure everybody has seen recently, really in the last 6 months, there have been half a dozen cities in Florida, of all places, attacked with ransomware. And, obviously these are smaller cities with smaller IT budgets, and the ransoms they're being asked to pay are scaled to something that is terribly painful, but that the attackers think they can actually get from them. And in fact, in the ones I've listed here, Key Biscayne, Lake City, Riviera Beach, and I don't think Baltimore paid the ransom, but the other ones did. You can see this is not just a problem for large scale enterprises that you think have deep pockets and therefore would be a target. With the easy availability of the malware now, essentially every enterprise is a worthwhile target. You just distribute the spear phishing emails and wait to see who bites and scale your ransom demands appropriately. It's actually a pretty viable financial enterprise for criminal organizations. And that actually brings me to my next polling question here regarding your Active Directory disaster recovery plan. Does it actually address the potential of a malware ransomware attack that disables the entire Active Directory? In these sort of scenarios, what happens is the malware runs through the network using Active Directory as kind of a vector, and then encrypts everything, including the domain controllers. So if you could take the time to answer this question here, we'll take a look at the responses. Does your ADDR plan address the potential of a complete Active Directory destruction? Okay, let's take a look at what people are saying here. Yeah, continue to answer if you haven't already, but it looks like about 50-50 of the people responding, they believe their DR plan will take into account a fully corrupted Active Directory environment. And then the other 50% includes obviously the people who have no DR plan at all for AD. And hopefully they've got a Bitcoin account with enough Bitcoins in it to pay the ransom.
Is Bitcoin still the cool cryptocurrency nowadays, or is there?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, I wish I knew.
All hackers like Bitcoin.
Okay,
yeah.
So clearly this is an area that we need to address with I would say a better Active Directory force recovery plan. So let's talk about what force recovery really looks like in practice. The basic outline of AD force recovery hasn't changed since, well, ever, I guess. The first step is figure out what backups you have that you can actually use, and this is harder than you might think. First off, you have to be sure that the data on the backups itself is workable. You know, are there major changes in the AD infrastructure like new sites or the schema or anything like that? Are those reflected in your backups, or have you made recent changes that you don't have on backup? You have to make sure that you have a valid backup from at least one valid backup from every domain in your forest. And you need to make sure that the backups themselves are free of the malware that you're suffering from. I mean, modern malware now doesn't just sort of, you know, the guy doesn't click on the email and suddenly his machine is dead. It can sit for a long time in infected binaries on workstations and servers and domain controllers, and either be activated through some remote control or just be activated on a calendar basis and then take over your network all at once. And of course, in that situation, you've got the problem of backups that are infected with that malware. So you have to somehow be able to assess if your backups are clean of that malware, which means you have to have done some sort of forensics to figure out what the malware actually is. You also need to make sure that the backups are physically available to the machines that need it. If you have a widely distributed network and you've got domain controllers on the far end of low bandwidth network links, you need to be able to get those backup images somehow to those sites. So actually figuring out what the backups are and where they're located and getting them to the right place is the first step, and it's not as easy as you might think. After that, you recover the first domain controller in the forest root, and then recover a DC in each of the remaining domains in the forest. Spend some time cleaning up metadata. I'm not going to go into those details, but it's usually a manual effort to convince Active Directory that it only has a handful of domain controllers in the forest. And then once you've got that all working properly, you can recover the remaining DCs. One of the things about recovering the domain controllers, there's really sort of four ways to do that. You can do what's called a system state restore, which is what you get by default with a Microsoft backup. It essentially saves the bulk of the operating system files and all the Active Directory data if you're doing a system state backup and restore on a domain controller. Then there's something called a bare metal restore, which we'll talk about more in a minute, which is essentially a bootable backup image that will restore the entire machine, including all of the boot binaries, the entire Windows environment, and device drivers and executables and all the Active Directory data. The third way to restore DC is install from media. This is a mechanism that's part of Active Directory that allows you to take a domain controller and back up essentially the Active Directory data plus configuration information and take it to a remote site and promote a domain controller from that backup. That has the advantage of not pulling the entire DIT across the network, and also has the advantage that it doesn't have to recover all of the operating system binaries, device drivers, and such. And finally, if you've virtualized some of your Active Directory environment, you have domain controllers running either on Hyper-V in your own data centers or in the public cloud, perhaps, you can recover snapshot images of those domain controllers. That's essentially the same as doing a system state backup, but it's something that you can't really use for older domain controllers, and I don't know if anybody on this call is still using something before Windows Server 2012. I know I have customers in Australia, large government agencies, in fact, which are still running on Windows Server 2008, believe it or not. So that is an issue for some people, and if you're running older versions of Windows, then doing VM snapshots is not really a way to recover your AD. So I'd like to ask another polling question here about how you are leveraging the cloud and virtualization for your DR plan. And the question is, does your AD DR plan rely on recovering domain controllers in the cloud? So if you can just take a minute to answer this question, we'll take a look at the results in just a little bit. So Darren, what have you found as far as people recovering domain controllers in these different ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen a lot of combinations of the slide that you just presented. The VM snapshot one is interesting because there's challenges around that. You have to be careful about not introducing USN rollback when you're doing snapshots. Most of the newer hypervisors are pretty good about handling some of that stuff, but you still have to be careful. I've just in my own testing environments using VM snapshots, I've run into all kinds of fun problems restoring a forest from snapshot. It's certainly challenging. System state tried and true, but I think we'll talk a little bit about how that can be challenging in this sort of new world of malware attacks. But that's what I see most people are relying on is system state backup still.
Yep.
And, just using a basic backup solution. Right.
Okay, let's take a look at the results of this poll here. So about a little less than a third are backing up have domain controllers in Azure, a little less than that in AWS, and then quite a large number aren't using virtual DCs as part of their DR plan at all. I guess that's not surprising. That seems about what I would expect.
Yeah, it's interesting to me too. I've seen more organizations putting DCs in their cloud environments, and primarily it's just to have authentication services close to domain joined VMs that are in those cloud environments as well. So they have a bunch of workload running on VMs in the cloud, and they're using, even Linux boxes using AD. They decided to put DCs close to them in the cloud.
Yep.
And it is interesting to see how that gets managed the same or differently than on-prem DCs.
Yep. Okay, so now let's take a look at bare metal recovery or bare metal restore and what some of the issues are with doing that. Intuitively, doing a bare metal backup and restore seems like a great idea because you're basically starting with the bare physical hardware and restoring a complete known good image on top of it. You're not worried about anything left on the disks that maybe affects the domain controller's behavior. But one of the problems with that approach is that advanced malware that is available in use today can infect the OS files and not give you any symptoms, which means that it can very easily get backed up along with the operating system files themselves. That essentially makes your backups useless or even, worse, dangerous, because if you don't know if your backups are infected, you can go through the whole effort of restoring your environment and just be reinfected again. And that would probably be worse than just starting from scratch. So that's one of the big problems with bare metal backups and restores. The second problem is that bare metal backup images, as you'd expect, are really large because they encompass everything. They have all of the device drivers, all the operating system files. In some sense, it's basically the whole disk itself. Large backups themselves aren't such a big problem, but if you want to keep fairly frequent backups of Active Directory, weekly would be, I think, sort of a bare minimum. That makes managing those backups kind of difficult because you have to handle all of the disk space associated with those large backup images. The third problem with bare metal restore backup images is again, due to their size, moving them to where you need them to do the recovery can be a problem as well. If you are working in a networking environment that has slow links, with large latencies, that can make a huge difference because it might take, literally days to copy a large backup image from where you have the backup stored to the domain controllers that actually need them. That's something to take into account in your disaster recovery plans. Is not just do you have the backups, but how do you get them to where they need to go in order to do the recovery. Darren, you did a little testing on backup sizes using the Semperis Active Directory Forest Recovery product along with System State and bare metal restores. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was just for my own sort of sanity check to understand sort of the scope of what we're dealing with when it comes to the different types of backups. And, really the key here is to understand, like Gil said, if you think about, storage of backups, you have however many DCs that you need to back up in your environment. And certainly we have customers that are backing up, many tens or even hundreds of DCs. Then the size of the backup becomes critical, not only from a disk storage perspective, but also, as Gil said, you have to get those backups to the DCs when you're in a recovery state, and from the DCs, frankly, when you're backing them up. And of course, if you're dragging them across WAN links or other low-speed links, then you're dealing with some serious backup windows. So my goal here was to just kind of get a sense of what the differences are. And this was just taking a Windows Server 2016, kind of bare bones Active Directory, not much in it. Obviously, the ratio of these different numbers will change as AD gets larger. But the point here is that with all of the things being equal, both System State and bare metal are substantially larger, kind of out of the box, than the approach that we take for our ADFR products.
Yeah, and looking at the ratio as the DID actually increases, even if you have, say, a 1 gigabyte DID or something like that, there's still between 17 and 26 gigabytes of overhead for each of those backup images. And if you're dealing with constrained media or slow networks, that's just a lot of bits to move to move around to actually get your restores working.
Yeah, for sure.
So problem number 4, bare metal backups are hardware dependent. And this is because they include the device driver binary files as well as all the device driver configuration. And this is a problem I've run into myself just in the lab environment, trying to recover on either a different hypervisor or a different physical machine, is because the devices are all configured in the backups and get restored along with the backups. In the worst case, the system doesn't boot at all. In the best case, you have to jump through some hoops during the recovery process to actually get the Windows to start. And you're sort of left with that feeling that maybe everything's not quite right because you don't know if you've actually covered all of the device drivers properly or if you have all of the expected drivers that you need for the new piece of hardware that you're restoring to. So it's another issue with bare metal recovery images. And finally, this isn't specifically a problem with bare metal recovery images. This is just an issue with force recovery in general. Force recovery is astoundingly difficult if you're trying to do it manually. Several years ago, I was running a set of Active Directory recovery workshops where we physically went through the exercise of recovering Active Directory data, both deleted objects and ultimately doing a full force recovery. And the lab environment that we gave everybody was pretty trivial. It was 2 domains and 2 DCs in each domain, so they could the students could get a sense of the effort involved. Just the individual commands that you have to type in for that kind of environment. There were 26 separate commands, each with, half a dozen command line switches or things that you had to input to get the thing right. And of the, how many students did I probably ran a couple hundred people through that over a couple of years. I would say fewer than 20% got it right on the first time. And the problem is that there's no indication that you've done anything wrong. It just doesn't work. So you don't know what you've done wrong. You don't know what to correct. You just have to go start over from scratch. So, like I said, this is not specifically a problem with bare metal recovery, but it actually talks to the importance of automating the recovery process because in the stress of an actual Active Directory recovery scenario, everything's gone south and you have the CEO and the CIO looking over your shoulder saying, when's AD going to be up so we can get our line of business apps running? I promise you're not going to do this right the first time if you're using manual tools. There's just no way it's going to happen. So that takes us to our next poll question, which is how or do you, in fact, automate any of your Active Directory disaster recovery plans? And if so, are you using a third-party product, tools that you've built yourself, or you're just going to go it alone and make do with the in-the-box tools? So we'll take a minute here and let everybody answer this question.
I like the coffee luck and can-do attitude. I've had several late-night coffee luck and can-do attitudes in my career.
Yep. Yeah, it's something you like to be able to have in your back pocket, but it's nothing I would want to bet the corporate network on.
Yeah, no.
Okay, looks like we're getting some poll answers in here. Go ahead and answer this question, and we'll head on to the next slide. Okay, let's see what we've got here. All right, so roughly 30% of the people responding say they use a third-party product. That's great. I think that's the only sane answer to recovering Active Directory. Some have built their own tools. That's pretty cool. I've gone through that exercise. It's a non-trivial process, to be sure. But if you're familiar with the tools that you've built and you know both how they work and how Active Directory works in a forest recovery situation, that's good. And more than half are relying on coffee, luck, and a can-do attitude. Well, we got a lot of can-doers there, so that's good.
That's always good.
All right, so what I'd like to do now is sort of turn this over to Darren to talk about the Symperis approach to Active Directory forest recovery. So Darren, let me just hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Gil. All right, so like Gil said, I'm going to talk a little bit about our Symperis AD forest recovery solution. The goal for us was to make the process of forest recovery as much of a no-brainer operation as possible. So that means automation. That means being able to handle these scenarios where you've got whether it's an sort of logical problem with AD, schema corruption, whatever kind of replication issues that sort of render AD as a service unavailable, but the underlying server is still up and running, or the physical corruption events that we've talked about with respect to malware. And so we want to be able to handle both of those scenarios with maximum flexibility, minimum chance of reinfection, obviously reduced disk space requirements, and really the key here is automating the entire process. So that's been the goal from day one with the product, and we think we've done a pretty good job of achieving that versus generic backup, like Microsoft manual approach or AD specific backups, by being able to really give you as much flexibility as possible during the Active Directory recovery process, not assume any part of Active Directory is up and running. I'd like to use the phrase a smoldering crater. If your Active Directory is a complete smoldering crater with no single DC left, we can still operate. Even if we get attacked and encrypted, we can still recover and operate our system. And that's super key for such a high-profile piece of infrastructure as Active Directory. So actually, before I get to that, let me just kind of jump in, and I'm going to do a little demo of the products of the Active Directory forest recovery, and you should be seeing a blank screen at the moment, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to log into my very simple test environment, or not. Let me see if I can get back onto that. And what I've got here is a single AD environment that I'm logging into the domain controller, single Active Directory domain controller environment. And what do I see? My domain controller has been hosed, and I need to recover it. And this could be, 100 domain controllers or one domain controller, but the point is I'm hosed. So what I'm going to do, and here's the problem, right? I've been backing up my DCs, but I don't know when this malware was actually introduced. So if I've got a backup, and I do a system state or a bare metal recovery of that DC, there's an even chance. I saw a slide the other day that said, I think the average time to discover an attacker has gotten into your environment is still something on the order of weeks. So, if this happens to you, you don't necessarily know which of your backups or BMR backups or system state backups are valid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut this bad boy down because I don't want any semblance of this server on my network anymore. And I'm going to come over to my ADFR server. And what I'm going to do is just kind of show you the administrative part of ADFR before I get into sort of the recovery process. But I have the ability, of course, to be able to see, to back up my Active Directory environment. I can check the status of backups, and we validate those backup sets to ensure that we have sufficient backups to be able to essentially recover a full forest. All of the management of the product is done within this user interface. But what I really want to do is go in and talk about the recovery process, because that's where the rubber meets the road. So I'm going to go into the recovery side and log into the recovery panel. Now, one thing to note about ADFR before I get in there is that we are not at all dependent on Active Directory for any aspect of the function of the product. So no DNS, no authentication, no AD required for copying backups around the network. Everything is architected to be what I call shared nothing, and giving you the ability to essentially recover your AD even if it's completely down. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the recovery side of ADFR, and I've got a few options here, but I'm going to choose the forced recovery option. That's the most interesting option to me in this particular case where my DC has been encrypted. Now, what I've done is I've spun up a new VM, and this VM has nothing on it. It's a clean, built from ISO VM right here, and the only thing it's got on it is my ADFR server, my ADFR agent. So I've got this new VM. It doesn't even have to be the same hardware configuration as the original VM that was backed up. I'm going to pick a backup from 715. I could have picked either of those. I've got my DC that was backed up, and it's showing me the backup of that. And, of course, the server's down now, so it's going to check the agent status, and it'll tell me that it's down. And once that's done, I can tell it the new server that I want to go to. And that new server will give me the ability to recover my AD. Oops. Sorry. I clicked too aggressively. I'll let it do its job again. So once this comes back, then what I can do is I can tell it, no, I want you to go to this new server and recover this one from backup. And so now it's found the agent on that new server, and I can go ahead and analyze it and click recover, and away I go. And so now I'm recovering my forest from backup to a new server, clean operating system, no chance of reintroducing the malware, just backed up to Active Directory and the parts that were needed for Active Directory. And it gives me maximum flexibility for being able to get back from any kind of disaster, whether it's malware-based or just logical corruption. So that's kind of the quick and dirty demo of ADFR. I think we have another poll, Gil, I think.
Yeah, we've got a couple. Actually, before we jump into that, how is ADFR handling the actual backup images themselves, as far as either storing them or moving them around?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we do is we have this concept of distribution points. So distribution points allow you to keep backups close to the DCs that are being backed up and also recovered, so that you can automatically get the backup from the closest distribution point to the DC during a recovery phase. So that's all managed centrally. You don't have to do anything. Once you set up a distribution point and tell the backup to go use that distribution point for a given set of DCs, that gets used both for backup and recovery going forward. So you have basically we sort of take care of that topology of making sure that the backups are as close to the distributor or to the DCs that are being recovered as possible. And what you noticed from that graph that Gil mentioned earlier is that we're just backing up the pieces of Active Directory we need to make a domain controller whole again. So we're deploying in the case of a malware situation where you have to deploy to alternate hardware. You may not have, let's say the backed up DC was physical, and let's say that the DC is no longer viable. Either you don't have the time to clean it, or you don't have the access to the physical servers, or whatever the case may be. Let's say you want to restore those physical DCs to virtual machines, either in the cloud or in your own on-prem ESX or Hyper-V environments. We don't have any requirements of the destination server hardware being identical like you do with system state or BMR. So you can essentially, using our backups, you can reintroduce Active Directory to a clean Windows OS, built from ISO or templates that you have in your virtual environment, whatever's the easiest. And you can do that with a very small footprint in terms of the size of the backup.
The notion of recovering to a different piece of hardware is actually pretty important because there is malware that can infect the server BIOS as well. So even if you wipe the disks and start from scratch, there's a small risk. I mean, it's not a common kind of malware, but it does exist. There's a small risk that you restore everything from scratch and you still end up with an infected machine because the malware is actually embedded in the BIOS on the server itself.
Yeah, I mean, there's, the other piece of this that I think people miss out on is that when Active Directory is down, think of all the back-end management infrastructure that is using Active Directory to get to the management tools. Like think about like ILO on physical servers. I mean, how many organizations out there are using AD for ILO authentication? Well, if ILO is, or if AD is down, you probably have some break glass accounts for ILO, but does everyone know where they are? Or maybe they're in a password vault that's protected using Active Directory.
Yeah, right.
I mean, the list of dependencies of AD goes on and on and on. So this is why, we made a point of not having any dependency on AD within our own tool. But you sometimes miss those dependencies when you're planning for this stuff, and it's super critical.
Well, that's in the Wired article about the Maersk attack. The fact that gates to the docks at various cities around the world were controlled by Active Directory credentials, and suddenly you can't open the gates, which means the trucks can't actually get to the docks to unload containers, and then the trucks end up lined up down the highway because there's nowhere for them to go. I mean, the knock-on effects were pretty crazy. Okay, so we got one more. Actually, we have two more polls here, but this one here, Semperis is running a raffle at Black Hat in Las Vegas. So if you're going to be at Black Hat, I'm not going to show the results to this, but if you're going to be at Black Hat and you're interested in entering the raffle, go ahead and click on this thing, and Semperis will hook you up so you can participate in that raffle down there in Las Vegas.
Yep. And the other thing I'll mention, since we're on the topic, is that I will be speaking at B-Sides Las Vegas, which happens in conjunction with Black Hat at the Tuscany Hotel, I think. I'll be speaking next Wednesday, and I'm going to be speaking on using group policy as a kind of threat vector, both from an intelligence gathering perspective and using group policy as an attack vector on organizations. And this comes out of a bunch of work that I've done in sort of identifying, sort of security issues in group policy and best practices around preventing attackers from taking advantage of group policy on top of AD.
Cool. Definitely, if you're going down to Black Hat, catch Darren's session. If you've ever seen Darren on the stage, he's definitely someone you want to listen to. All right, last poll here. Again, we won't be showing the results of this. And while this is up, we've got a handful of questions. Actually, got quite a few. So let me just go through the list here. Boom, okay. Yeah, if you can take care of those questions, that'd be awesome.
No problem. So, we have about 12 minutes left, guys. So please get your questions in. Even if we can't get to it today, we will have somebody follow up with you. So the first question, we'll just get right out the way. Chris wants to know, can you recommend a coffee that works best?
Well, for me, I live in Boise, and I recommend Dawson Taylor. They roast them locally here, and it's awfully good, and that keeps me awake at late night efforts. I can say that.
All right. Hopefully, I answered your question, Chris. Next, Luke wants to know, Gil and Darren, what is your personal professional opinion on paying the ransom, assuming the business has the funds?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I've not been put in that position. So when it comes to the rubber meeting the road, I'm not sure if I can give a really good answer. Philosophically, obviously, I'm pretty opposed to paying the ransom because it just makes the profitability of this sort of enterprise larger and more attractive. And I think there's been recently a couple of organizations have come out publicly saying that that's a bad idea. In fact, Darren, didn't Mickey, wasn't Mickey quoted in that regard recently?
Yeah, I don't recall the details, but I know he had some comments about that as well. And I tend to agree with you. I think it's a bad precedent. I think the sad part about it is that the organizations that are impacted, things like municipalities, are in the least favorable position to be able to do anything about this. I mean, they're just rendered completely out of the water and have limited resources to be able to really recover from this kind of thing. So it's just sad. I think it's despicable, frankly.
I mean, in a lot of ways, it's like paying the mafia protection money. I mean, I think it's just a bad idea to pay it. And the real answer is to tip the risk calculation back in your favor, which means that you want to both reduce the likelihood of an attack, which means getting on top of patching your machines and that sort of thing, and also reduce the impact of an attack. And that means being able to recover easily. I mean, truthfully, if you think about it, if you could make a forced recovery be effectively no effort and instantaneous, like recovering a deleted file or something like that, you almost wouldn't care about anybody attacking your Active Directory because the cost of it would be so low. And I think that's really what we need to focus on is to reduce the likelihood of an attack by good security practices, better forms of authentication and credential management, better management of patching and that sort of thing, because all of these tend to propagate because of unpatched machines. That and then reducing the costs of the attack itself. I think that's the best way to do it.
All right. So we have a question here from Philip. He wants to know, can you back up and restore individual objects or OUs?
We actually have a product called Directory Services Protector that has the ability to do object and attribute level change tracking and rollback. So that product is specifically geared towards that level of granularity within Active Directory, as opposed to the forced recovery, which is more about kind of recovering the big pieces of AD, like partitions or forests or even individual domain controllers. But the point here is that DSP is really optimized for that scenario you've just mentioned.
All right. Okay, so Eric has a question for you. He wants to know, how does Semperis guard against malware or protect them or detecting malware?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, what I described in my demo and in the slides are how we handle the scenario where you might have malware embedded in your backups, system state or bare metal or whatever, and don't know when they got there or even what they are. The chances of the reality is when malware hits, when it goes active, you're not going to have time to do forensic analysis on what's the malware and where is it and what are the individual systems that are impacted. You sort of have to react, right? You have to recover first and ask questions later. And so what we tried to do with our solution is to decouple the Active Directory backup from the operating system. So the way we protect against reintroducing malware that has been introduced into the operating system and then made its way into your backups is you lay down in that scenario, you lay down a new destination server that's vanilla ISO, built from templates that are known good, or built from ISO from Microsoft, and then we lay down Active Directory on that new destination. Now, there's another kind of attack on AD that is infinitely, well, I wouldn't say infinitely, but it's much harder to deal with. And that's when you've got attackers that have created backdoor accounts, have taken over or guessed passwords, cracked credentials on multiple accounts. And in that scenario, doing a recovery from backup, regardless of the approach, is more problematic because you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what accounts have been compromised and what accounts haven't. And so in that case, the best you can do is recover to a point in time where you think you have a known good AD, and then do things like resetting of secrets on privileged accounts, resetting of secrets on other accounts. We've actually put together some thoughts on this, and I think it's going to be in a blog post pretty soon. But this kind of attack, this kind of where the data in AD is compromised, it's not really a malware attack. It's really more of an attack on Active Directory itself. It becomes more problematic, and there's frankly, there's not a lot of great solutions there right now.
All right,
Gil, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I think that that pretty much covers it.
Okay. Again, we have about 4 minutes left, so if you have any questions, please get them in so we can follow up. This next question is: can't you use the native tools to do a forced recovery?
I touched on this earlier, and the answer is you can. But the likelihood of success is, I would say, close to zero, especially in a real world recovery situation where everybody is stressed and running around like chickens with their heads cut off. As I mentioned, in a very controlled, trivial environment, the success rate using a completely scripted recovery process with all of the commands typed out with exactly the things you had to type in at the command prompt, the hit rate was about 20%, or the success rate was about 20%. So I would never count on recovering an Active Directory forest using the Microsoft tools. I think it's almost like not having a plan.
Next question we have is: if we run all of our infrastructure in the cloud, do we have to worry about forest recovery?
Darren, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a reasonable question. So the reality is that if an attacker has access to your domain controllers, and it really doesn't matter where they run. I mean, most organizations I know are hybrid with respect to their domain controllers, so they're running some on-prem, some in the cloud. But by definition, you need network access between those because you need to do replication still, you need to manage those domain controllers in the cloud, et cetera. So if you have network access from on-prem to the cloud, you have network access for attackers to be able to propagate their nasty stuff into the cloud. So I think, essentially not any different than having them on-prem. You probably have, the big difference is if something goes wrong in the cloud, you can blame the cloud provider. That's about the biggest advantage of it. But that's not much of an advantage.
Yeah, I think that's something to be clear on is just because your DC is running in the cloud, it doesn't really make it any different than a DC running anywhere else. The only advantage, I think, is that you have the potential to have snapshot recovery, which can be pretty quick. But you still have to incorporate that in an Active Directory recovery process. You can't just sort of restore all the snapshots and hope that everything's going to work after that, because generally speaking, it doesn't. Okay.
All right. Sounds good. Here we have about a minute left. I just wanted to get any closing comments or any thoughts from you guys. And again, audience, we'll get back to your questions. We'll follow up with you. But Gil, Darren, do you guys have any closing thoughts?
No, I think we covered it pretty well. The thing that struck me with the polling questions was the number of people who still don't have an Active Directory recovery plan or a plan that they think will work. And that's, I think that's something that you really need to look hard at, because the threats are real. This isn't like waiting for a hurricane to take your power out and then having to recover from that. I mean, that's a pretty rare occurrence. Attacks via malware are now indiscriminate, and they're so cheap for criminals to mount that no one is really safe from it. It's if anybody has someone in the organization who's likely to open an email with a sketchy link, you're at risk, and the attackers really don't care how big you are or how much money you might have or anything like that. They're just happy to have you click on the link, and because it costs them nothing, right? So I think closing thought is you need an Active Directory disaster recovery plan. Well, you need an overall disaster recovery plan, and AD has to be a core component of that. And if you're having trouble getting buy-in from management to build one, then let them watch this recording, or at least take some of the slides and show them what the risks really are.
All right, guys, thank you so much. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today, and Gil and Darren for presenting. The webcast was sponsored by Semperis and presented by Redmond Magazine. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Obun, and happy birthday again.
Thank you.
Happy birthday.